I'm not often not doing the sort of health economics that people think of when they think of a health economist. A lot of mine is more in the broader issues around health. So because I wasn't sure of the audience sort of mix today, what I thought I'd do is to do something that's basically that I teach on Masters of Public Health courses when they're doing an economic evaluation course, and to give that first sort of introduction to a little bit about how do economists think. So I apologise if some of this seems sort of rather sort of A-level economics, but some people have never come across this before, so it can be just a useful thing to go through. And as I say, some of these elements will come up, and when you're looking at economic evaluations, you should hopefully start to see concepts and ideas and be able to place them more in mind. So yeah, so some economic concepts. So important for economic evaluation, important for evaluation. So I've sort of separated out the evaluation, economic evaluation, because a lot of what I do, what I would describe as program evaluation, which is more on the concerns of does it work, rather than economic evaluation, which is concerned of is it cost effective. But obviously there's relationships between the two. So by the end of this, hopefully, you'll have some sense of different types of efficiency, start to think about what opportunities costs are, but the most important thing maybe is this idea that economists like to try and think at the margin, and what does that mean? There we are. So just in general, what is economics? So economics is this idea of the study of scarcity. But it's about, and therefore the study of allocation, but it's also about behavior and choice. It's about incentives. It's about a way of thinking. But I mean, generally it gets summed up in this idea of how to use limited resources in the best possible way. I mean, I think it's quite a narrow definition, that last one, and I like to think of it more in terms of the whole incentives and behaviors that underpin it. Many of you will know that economics is generally split into this concept of microeconomics and macroeconomics. So microeconomics is very much about individuals, households, firms, local authorities, doctors, these small units. And often, you know, we're interested here in about some element of a market. And so even though the sort of economic evaluation or healthcare that we think of, we don't necessarily think of as occurring in a market, what we are dealing with is market failure. And often that the environment in which activities exist because of market failure. So we're trying to make things work, if not exactly like a market, then at least in some way to proxy like a market. So, I mean, the obvious example in health is, in health, we ration by weighting rather than rationing by price, but we still have elements of demand and supply in there. Macroeconomics, these are the sort of the more what you sort of expect to see on the news on a regular basis, you know, GDP, inflation, growth, unemployment, interactions between different sectors of the economy, trade. Now I'm very much a microeconomist. Health economics is very much a microeconomics topic. Program evaluation, again, all using concepts from microeconomics. So if there is some underlying economic model in a lot of evaluation work, it's generally because it's coming from a microeconomic foundation, whether that's explicitly written out or just implicit in the modeling. And then we can split economics into the sort of two sorts of thought. So there's positive economics, which is the economic statements that describes how things are. So the example being their government-funded healthcare increases public expenditure, as opposed to normative economics, which is how things perhaps should be. The government should spend more money on healthcare. So we're trying to split up these sort of ideas of positive and normative economics. And positive economics comes up with statements. You know, we then have policy or changes that occur as a result of those statements, and then we're trying to use positive economics to say things along the lines of, well, do they work? Do they work? Are they cost effective? So that's the sort of work that a lot of research economists do, as well as broader, wider issues some of which I will touch upon, I think, as I go through these slides. So I'm going to talk about a lot of important concepts. I mean, if I was teaching this as a sort of standard economics degree, we would spend a lot of time on each of these, but I'm going to scoot through some of these. Some I will focus on more than others, in sense of where I feel that they're sort of more important for the sorts of issues that you may be dealing with. So the first one's efficiency, and I'm going to come back to efficiency because that's crucial. I suppose what I would like to say about efficiency here is that a lot of my work and a lot of the research I've done has been in the areas of health inequalities. And generally what we think of is that there's an efficiency equity trade-off, that you cannot have both together. We either have a bigger pie or we have a more even pie. Bigger pies are often associated with more uneven pies. And so we've always got to bear that in mind. Economic evaluation has largely come from the efficiency side of the concept rather than equity, although there have been efforts to try to introduce equity ideas into economic evaluation and the way that economic evaluations are done. But it's always one thing to bear in mind: efficiency and equity. How do we balance those two things out? I'm not really going to deal with equity here because it's far more of a normative concept. I'm going to concentrate particularly just on efficiency. So the next thing to always bear in mind is when you're thinking about economics, you're reading economic papers with economics in them, is the concept of ceteris paribus. So that's this idea that all other things being equal. So setting all other things equal, if we change one thing, what do we expect to happen? Or what can we predict will happen? Or what can we understand about behavior if we change that one thing? Now, in some ways, this seems like a restrictive assumption because obviously everything doesn't say equal. But when it comes to evaluation, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to set everything up as being equal, apart from the intervention that we're changing. If you think about it in the classic randomized control trial setting, if you're trying to think whether something works or not, then that very much is ceteris paribus. Everything is randomized. That creates equality in all of the unobservables, and then you change one thing, and that is the intervention in which you are considering. From there, you should be able to go, does something work? Does something not work? So it's not just an economics concept, it's there as a gold standard in all sorts of evaluations as well. The next concept I just want you to bear in mind is this idea of indifference. So, I mean, indifference is very much, as it says, I can't choose between two things. And this is very much a concept in terms of utility. So in economics, we consider individuals as utility maximizers or maximizing something. And so what we really want to say is, let's say you've got two bundles of goods, and can you rank them? If you say bundle A is better than bundle B, then you're not indifferent between them. You prefer bundle A to bundle B. If, however, bundle A and bundle B will provide you with exactly the same levels of utility, then you would at that point say, well, I'm indifferent between bundle A and bundle B. We have points of indifference. And then we can think about this about all possible bundles of goods. How do we rank them? Do we prefer them? Or are we indifferent between them? And then points where we consider to have equal utility, points of indifference, we join together in indifference curves. And that gives us a graphical representation, a graphical way of thinking about it. And I've got an example of that coming up in a moment. The next idea to introduce is this idea of diminishing returns. So we generally think of resources and utility, benefits, costs, as not necessarily proportionate in their use. So often when we talk about economies of scale represent decreasing marginal costs. So as you produce more of a good, each unit becomes cheaper to produce. So the total costs are going up, but the marginal costs are falling. In terms of benefit, we think about it in terms of the more we have of something, the less we value the next unit, the next additional unit. And again, I've got examples of this just in a very sort of simplistic fashion. Related to these ideas are marginal rates of transformation. So that's for supply, and substitution, that's for demand. So this is thinking about how we have resource use for supply and how we can substitute resources between each other, and in terms of demand, how I demand goods and how I can substitute those between each other in order to obtain utility. And we often find that marginal rates of transformation, marginal rates of substitution, again, have some element of a diminishing nature to them. So resources that we use for one thing are not necessarily good for something else. And I was just thinking about sort of examples for this. If you imagine, if you've got lots of doctors and you want more teachers, doctors are not necessarily good at teaching, so therefore you lose something in that rate of transformation. People who are teachers, if you got lots of teachers but you want more doctors, to make those people who were teachers doctors requires resource shifts. And so these are the sorts of things that we're thinking about in terms of marginal rates of transformation. Finally, on this side, and again, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more specifically later on, is opportunity costs. And this is crucial in economics, this idea of, in order to do what we are going to do, what do we have to give up? And measuring everything in terms of opportunity cost is not necessarily the same as measuring in terms of just cost. It's all of the wider implications. But as I say, I'll return to those. So that brings us on to efficiency, which is probably the sort of the crucial part, and a crucial part of economic evaluation. So we can think of two types of efficiency. One is a technical stroke productive efficiency. Those terms are used interchangeable, to technical efficiency, productive efficiency. And we can consider this one of two ways. We can either say the highest output for a given cost or the lowest cost for a given output. They're the same thing. If we achieve either of those, we will be technically efficient, productively efficient. So for a given budget, how many vaccines can we produce? What's the lowest cost to produce a given number of operations? So that's very much technical and productive efficiency. The other element of efficiency is allocative efficiency. And strictly in economics, we consider this to be where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Or another way of thinking about it is, if you've ever come across these concerns of these ideas of Pareto optimality, some sense of nobody can be made better off without making somebody worse. So allocative efficiency is a little bit more difficult to picture compared to technical and productive efficiency. But the difference matters. And it matters because in economic evaluations, and when you're evaluating anything, you have to start to think about from what perspective are we considering an evaluation? Are we considering it from a small units perspective, so let's say a hospital's perspective or a healthcare services perspective, or are we considering it from a societal perspective, from a much broader perspective? Now, it may be the case for things, and if you come across a lot of economic evaluation, you'll have come across cost effectiveness analysis. Cost effectiveness analysis is all about technical and productive efficiency, whereas cost benefit analysis is all about allocative efficiency. Now, if something's allocatively efficient, it will be technically efficient, that's fine. But something that's technically efficient does not necessarily have to be allocatively efficient. And you can think about this sort of in a local, in a local authority standpoint. When you're thinking about the next pound that you spend, what you want is for the benefit for the next pound that you spend in any area to be the same across all areas. If that were the case, you would be allocatively efficient. If it's not the case, if there's more benefit to be had in one area than another, then you're not allocatively efficient. You should be readjusting where your resources go. So this matters. It matters for perspective. In terms of practicalities, this is the sort of the classic textbook example of technical and or productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. So very two-dimensional, very simplified. We've got two goods in our society, and generally in economists, we think about defending ourselves and eating. So the two goods are generally guns and butter. So if you think of guns on the y-axis, butter on the x-axis, then we can put all of our resource use into producing guns. So that will be where our concave line in the left-hand figure crosses the y-axis. So all our resources are put into guns. Alternatively, we could put all of our resources into butter, and that would be where the concave line crosses the x-axis. If we think then about all possible combinations of resource use to produce mixes of guns and butter, we plot that concave line. Now it's concave because we've got marginal rates of transformation. How are the goods that are useful for producing guns switched across to producing butter, or vice versa? And therefore we also get diminishing returns. So some things, fertile land, are very, very good for producing butter. They're less good for producing guns. So that means if you think we start from the y-axis, from where the concave line crosses the y-axis, to produce quite a lot of butter, we have to give up very few guns. So produce a lot of butter, we give up very few guns. As we move around the concave curve towards the x-axis, now to produce more butter, we're having to give up increasing amount of guns. So this shows you our changes in our marginal rates of substitution. Then we've got some points. So anything between the axes and the concave curve, so such as where point A is, are inefficient points. Only points upon the line are efficient, and this is what technical efficiency is trying to do. It's get us to the points on the line. So point B, point C, point D, they're all efficient points, but they might not necessarily be our preferred point. And that's when we now start to think about allocative efficiency, so the right-hand panel. So we have the same concave line. I should have said these lines are called production possibility frontiers because it shows all possible combinations of production of these two goods. So on the right-hand side now we've got allocative efficiency, we've got our production possibility frontier, but superimposed on top of that now we have our indifference curves. So as I said, indifference curves show the points of indifference. So I've got two indifference curves there, a solid one, so that's one set of indifferent points. As a society, so these represent society's preferences, if you like. As a society, any point on that solid convex line, I'm indifferent between. Or any point on the convex dashed line, I'm indifferent between. However, I prefer higher indifference curves to lower indifference curves. So the further away the indifference curve is from the origin, the better that indifference curve is. So what this is saying is I've overlapped the indifference curves. Point B lies along the dotted indifference curve. Point C lies upon the solid indifference curves. Therefore, society prefers point C to point B. That would be allocatively efficient. We can readjust our resources in order to get to a better point in terms of allocative efficiency. So say both points are productively efficient, but only one is allocatively efficient. Again, indifference curves, they're convex because of diminishing returns. You know, if I have lots of guns, I'm happy to give up some guns to gain a bit of butter. If I have lots of butter, I'm willing to give up a lot of butter to give a small amount of guns. And then as we move backwards and forwards along the curves. So that's what cost effectiveness is trying to do on the left-hand side. Cost benefit analysis is trying to do think about allocative efficiency on the right-hand side. Now we can only think about this is if we think about efficiency in terms of opportunity costs. So we have things that we wish to do, but we've also got to think about, therefore, things that we want to give up. So as I say, what are they? This isn't simply the money that you're going to spend. it can reflect all sorts of things that are going to be sacrificed in order to be able to do what it is that you want to spend your money on. So any option, what's the next best alternative? Now, they're actually notoriously difficult to actually measure. I mean, to think about what exactly the opportunity costs are, we can reduce them into dimensions. So we can say, well, look, if I want to undertake more vaccines, you cannot have more hip replacements. So the money I'm going to spend on vaccines, the opportunity cost are the hip replacements that are now foregone by spending money on vaccines. But that's very two-dimensional. I mean, it isn't saying, well, actually, there's a whole set of things that I'm giving up by spending money on vaccinations. It's rare that we're in a world of you've got two things you can do, A or B, and you can just go, well, B is the opportunity cost. In a market, opportunity costs are easy. We observe opportunity costs all the time because we have a price mechanism. And price is wonderful because it just fits out. This is what we're sacrificing because we know what we could spend our money on. We've got a common numeraire. It's all done in price. Easy. But outside of markets, so in any terms of any public sector decision making, they're much, much more difficult to define. But we do have to think about them in terms of the wider concepts of resource consumption. And it's just useful to think about these things. So I'll raise a few things that you may face or come across in your own lives and work. So challenges for local authorities particularly can be, what's the opportunity costs of increased social care spending? So we're currently working with Islington Local Authority as part of the School of Public Health Research to try and help them understand some elements about their social care spending and how you can predict that and think about sort of resource allocation model around that in order to think about spending, so that you can think about, well, actually, where else could our money be spent if we're not increasing our social care spending? And of course, opportunity costs aren't necessarily static. They will change over time. What's the opportunity costs of increasing safe green spaces? So again, it's not just this case of, well, we want to expand a park. We want a new green space. You have to think of, well, that space could have been used for housing. It could have been used for transport. It could have been used for businesses. So these are the things that the opportunity costs involved in expanding green spaces. The classic one, and again, if you've come across evaluation in healthcare, economic evaluation in healthcare, you'd have maybe come across this in terms of NICE and their approval of new pharmaceuticals. What are the opportunity costs of new pharmaceuticals? Well, they have a threshold. NICE, they have their £30,000 per QALY, so per quality adjusted life year. So if a new intervention produces one QALY for less than £30,000, we consider that it will be funded as part of the NHS. It will be approved for NHS use. So they're sort of, I was going to say explicitly, but that threshold is actually quite implicit, but we all know it exists at around £20,000 to £30,000. But they're basically, this is what the opportunity cost is. But it's a good example because actually it doesn't really demonstrate what the true opportunity cost is at all, because as new interventions become available or become part of the NHS and become possible to be prescribed, well, without disinvestment, that means money is being squeezed out from somewhere else. So it's not simply, oh, we've got something that can provide a QALY for £30,000. It's by providing that, I'm now also losing something else. So the opportunity costs are actually broader than necessarily NICE are thinking about. But then they need some decision-making process. So that's why they have that in place. I've actually just, on the last slide, I've just got some suggested readings, and I think the threshold is a particularly interesting one around opportunity costs. And I've got an article that I think is interesting there and quite an easy read to give you a sense of the thought processes behind opportunity costs and thresholds. The next thing I want to discuss is this idea of thinking at the margin. So marginal questions would be things like the age at which mammography screening starts, or should we increase an area of green spaces in our town and cities, or should we increase social care spending? Now, why are these marginal decisions? Well, economics is not concerned about totals. It's not concerned really about averages. What it wants to know is, should we do more of something? Should we do less of something? So everything is about thinking at the margin. I mean, I've already talked through marginal benefit, marginal cost, marginal rates of substitution. So as we change one small thing, what outcome difference do we see? If any of you read the research literature and you've come across anything involving a regression and data analysis, generally data analysis is presenting some parameter estimate, and that parameter estimate is a marginal estimate. If we change our variable by one small amount, how does our outcome variable change? That's what thinking at the margin is about. And in fact, if you are familiar with regression and you've ever come across data analysis of that type, and you think, well, I've got all of these different variables, the ceteris paribus part is saying, holding all of those variables fixed apart from one, what's the marginal change? So you sort of get the ceteris paribus and the margin coming in together. So I mean, the classic example, and the one I always like to use in healthcare, comes from the historical epidemiology literature, which is basically that spending on healthcare, in terms of its total effect on life expectancy, is minimal. It's had barely any impact. Vaccinations, barely any impact on our improvements in life expectancy. Most gains in life expectancy occurred before any particularly significant spending in healthcare happened. That's not to say that spending on healthcare is not important. An increase in spending on, as I say, screening here may increase the health for some individuals considerably. So at the margin, something could be very important. In total, it may seem unimportant. But we've got to be very, very clear about what we think at the margin or totals. And economics is very much about this marginal thinking. So we're always asking, what are the benefits and costs of doing a little bit more? What are the benefits and costs of doing a little bit less? And then, if the benefits from doing a little bit more outweigh the costs of doing a little bit more, then we should do it from an efficiency perspective. Now, to some degree, I'm assuming that we've got no fixed budget types of issues, and sometimes, cost effectiveness analysis for real decisions, it comes to the case that we do things that are inefficient, or not necessarily inefficient, but not necessarily the most cost effective, because we've got a fixed budget. If a program is going to cost £1 billion, but it's highly cost effective, but I've only got 500 million, I can't do it. But I may have another program that is not quite as cost effective that costs 500 million, I can do that. So in the strictest sense, it's not necessarily the most efficient, but in terms of a fixed budgetary concerns, it is the most efficient. So as I said, I mean, I've already talked through with the production fund here. I talked about marginal benefits, marginal costs. I talked about how the marginal rates of substitution. I talked about the indifference curves and the marginal benefits. In terms of allocative efficiency, you can see why this marginal thinking becomes so important. And if you think about it just from a firm's perspective, so you've got a profit maximizing firm, that's what they're concerned is, that's their objective function. So if a firm, you make one more unit, to make one more unit will cost you £10, but you can sell that unit at its price of £12, I make that unit. And you keep producing units until the cost of making units is £12, at which point you stop. So that is the point of allocative efficiency. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And that is the same across all sectors. So is the marginal increase in health benefit that arises from spending on mammography screening equal to the marginal cost? And here, though, we'd have to think about what else we could spend that extra money on, that if we're going to expand mammography screening. So this brings us back to a classic example of economic evaluation. And again, if you involved in economic evaluation, done it before, or some interest come across literature, you may have come across the idea of the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. But this idea again of thinking at the margin. So this is a stool screening program and undertaking series of tests on a stool to see how many cases of a disease can be detected. Now, I'm no bench scientist, so don't ask me exactly how it works. All I know is these numbers in front of me. So what you can see is that the more that we test the stool, the more cases we detect, the higher the costs are for doing each test, but we can work out the average cost per case detected. And if we do one test, the average cost per case detected, is just under £1,200. If we do 6 tests, the average cost per case detected is just about $2,500. $2,500. I mean, this is quite old, from 1975. It's a classic teaching tool in health economics. But let's just say we can think about it in terms of NICE's threshold of around £20,000, £30,000. I mean, that's not going to be far off around $25,000. So if you think about a threshold of $25,000, average cost per case, these tests look great. Do the tests, get more cases, average cost per case. But what we want to do is not think of it in terms of averages, but think of it in terms of margins. So now what I've got is got the same table. So it's still got the number of cases, the costs, the average cost, but now what I've added is 3 more columns, and they are the marginal numbers. So I've got the total number of cases detected and then the marginal number of cases detected. Now, what we can see here is we have diminishing marginal benefit. We do 1 test, we get 66 cases. We do 2 tests, the second test picks up an additional 5 cases. We do 3 tests, the tests pick up, that extra test picks up an additional half a case. So we've got diminishing marginal benefit. We also have diminishing marginal cost. So if we look at the marginal cost of testing rounds, to do the test first time costs $77,000, $77,500. But now, of course, we've got all of our setup costs involved. So to do it a second time only costs us an extra $30,000. To do it a third time only costs us an extra $22,000. So we've got diminishing marginal costs, we've got diminishing marginal benefit. Now, let us now compare our marginal benefits to our marginal costs in our marginal cost per case detected. Now, when we do 1 test, the marginal cost per case is going to be equal to the average cost, because we're simply dividing the marginal number of cases and the marginal costs of the case. So 77,500 divided by 65.94, and that's going to be $1,175. But when we go down, what we can see is that the marginal cost per case detected increases, and not just increases, but increases rapidly, to the point that the marginal cost per case detected for the 6th test, so taking the 6th test, is costing us $47 million per case detected. Now, suddenly, we're not going to do that. So now, if we're thinking about our threshold, we'd do 2 tests, but we'd stop at that. So this is why thinking at the margin is so important. On average, these look like reasonable approaches, but at the margin, they do not. And so what cost effectiveness analysis is trying to do, and incremental cost effectiveness analysis is trying to do, is to get us to think in that marginal fashion. What happens if we do a little bit more? Is it worth that extra money? Now, of course, here I have been a little bit brushed around the fact there's actually 2 types of margins here. One is an extensive margin and one is an intensive margin. So the extensive margin is going from 0 tests to 1 test. So that's doing the tests. That's the extensive margin. The intensive margin is now how many tests should we do? But it's still all margin analysis. Going from 0 to 1 is still a margin analysis as going to 1 to 2. We just think of them slightly different margins that we're dealing with. But it's a nice learning tool to say, once we think at the margin, we can get to very, very different conclusions in terms of cost effectiveness. Now, what I thought it would be interesting to do, certainly from my perspective, is to sort of show you an example from my work. So this isn't from economic evaluation, but it is from screening. So it is based on screening. So as we know, screening is undertaken on asymptomatic individuals to see whether they have the presence of a disease or not. Now, I've simplified this a lot, but it's really good because it's a really interesting way to think of trade-offs and opportunity costs and thinking at the margin all in one go. So screening, generally the way that screening works is that there's some continuous marker, and that continuous marker is classified at some binary classification point, so some threshold. And if that marker is above a certain value, you consider to have a positive test result, which generally indicates the presence of a condition. And if it's below a certain value, you're considered to have a negative test result, which suggests absence of a particular condition. So we have positives, negatives. You know, in screening, we go, you know, this bowel cancer screening. You know, for bowel cancer screening, you know, positive would suggest the presence of cancer, negative would suggest the absence of cancer. But that is purely on the basis of this binary continuous underlying marker and to whether it passes some threshold value. Now, you can have a receiver operator curve. So receiver operator curves, what they plot is possible combinations of sensitivity. So that's a screening test's ability to designate an individual with the disease as positive, and specificity. So that's the test's ability to designate an individual who does not have the disease as negative. You may have come across this: sensitivity and specificity. What's our ability to spot a true positive? What's our ability to spot a true negative? And of course, what we want is screening tests, or any test, any diagnostic test, any screening test, to be able to discriminate between positives and negatives as best as possible. However, for a given test, you have to trade off sensitivity and specificity. And what we were doing was saying, well, we know how people who produce tests come up with these thresholds, but do individuals who take tests have preferences over specificity and sensitivity, or sensitivity and specificity, especially if individuals exhibit risk aversion? And so therefore they may think about whether at certain combinations of sensitivity and specificity they're willing to do a test, and at some they're unwilling to do a test. So there's trade-offs. So the receiver operator curves provides us with these points of trade-offs. It's slightly more simple, well, I hope it's slightly more simple things if I just put it into some numbers. So just concentrate on the panel on the left there for a moment. So this is for a given test. So these numbers represent numbers from a receiver operator curve. So I could have, for my test, I could choose my threshold at a point of 50% sensitivity and 74.3% specificity. So this is reading in that top row. Or I could choose the point that has 60% sensitivity and 64.3% specificity, or I could choose the threshold at the point 70% sensitivity and 51.4% specificity. So as you say, I increase sensitivity, but specificity is falling. Let's say we've got a condition that has a prevalence in the population of 30%. So at the bottom there, you'll see it says prevalence 30%. What do those combinations of sensitivity and specificity mean for us? Well, let's take the middle one. Let's take sensitivity at 60% and specificity at 64.3%. Now, if prevalence is 30%, then in a population of 100 people, we would expect 30 people to have the condition. So we look at our true positive rate, and our true positive rate with the sensitivity 60%, specificity 64.3%, our true positive rate is 18%. That means 18% people with the disease, with the condition, will be identified correctly as having the condition, and now they can receive treatment. But it also means that 12 individuals are false negatives. 12 individuals, they have the condition, but they have got the wrong result. So our binary classification has said they're negative when they are in fact positive. Now, if this is a serious condition, we may think, well, actually, we really, really don't want that. We want to have more people who have the condition identified as having the condition. And to do that, we would increase sensitivity. So now we move from that middle column to the right-hand one to the 70% sensitivity. Now the true positive rate goes up to 21%. So we've got more people who have the condition identified as having the condition, and our false negative rate has dropped to 9%. So there's a marginal change. We've changed the threshold at the margin. We've gained more true positives. We've reduced our false negatives. Some real benefit, but there's a trade-off. And the trade-off comes in terms of false positives. So in our initial choice, when it was 60%, 64.3% sensitivity specificity, we had a false positive rate of 25%. So in a population of 100, 25 people were receiving treatment they did not need. When we increased the sensitivity and reduced the specificity, our false positive rate went up to 34%. So now 34 people are receiving treatment that they do not need. And if the false positive treatment, if that treatment is invasive, is major, that is a real loss in terms of health, in terms of utility, in terms of costs to society. So that's the trade-off that we're facing. True positives against false positives. And what are people's preferences over those? If you move on to that right-hand panel where prevalence drops to 10%, so now it's a much rarer condition, you can see that the penalties involved can actually be really quite large. So if you again take the middle column where it was 60%, 64.3% sensitivity specificity combination, the true positive rate now is 6%. So 6 people out of 100 who have the condition will be identified as having the condition. If we increase the sensitivity, we will get one more person out of our 100. We go from 6% to 7%. We gain one more person. But look what happens to our false positive rate. We go from 32%, so 32 people out of 100 getting a false positive, getting unnecessary treatment, and that increases now to 44%. So that's an extra 12 people out of our 100 getting unnecessary treatment. Now, you may have come across the issues around breast screening and whether you should be doing more or less breast cancer screening because of the false positive rates and because of the unnecessary treatment that false positives occur. The genomic testing, which appears so much in the 10-year plan, is going to fall foul of an awful lot of this. The reason we do not screen for prostate cancer is largely because of this problem around false positives and excess treatment costs. So these are things that you can think of. So say we presented this to individuals and we asked them to make their trade-off and to pick where they want. Generally, people were more keen, especially if they're risk averse, on more on having more false positives over false negatives. But that was sort of just on average, and that's what risk aversion does for you. Okay, so I've covered quite a lot there in terms of an introduction to economics. And I hope in terms of giving you some sense of where economics concepts are fitting into economic evaluation. Mostly, I think if you can come away and just start to think, can I think at the margin? Can I start to think at the margin? And because that helps to tie all of our concepts together. Can I think at the margin? Can I get some sense of what opportunity costs are, even if I cannot exactly cost them up? And again, just going back to the opportunity costs and perspective, I talked about perspective. So for a healthcare service provider, if you're providing a new intervention, your opportunity costs in terms of your spending may be different to if I was dealing with something from a societal perspective and I got to think of all of the societal costs. So again, that's the technical efficiency, allocative efficiency issues coming into play. Within all of that, though, there's an awful lot that I haven't covered, and obviously I have just sort of gone through this introducing concepts rather than going through them in depth. But so we haven't talked about incentives, we haven't talked about fairness and equity, we haven't talked about demand and supply, we haven't talked about market, and market failure is really where health economics came from. And that's sort of the crux. And again, in the reading, I've got the key article that was in the listed in there, which was in the American Economic Review by Ken Arrow back in 1963, which is really the start of health economics. And you'll start to see a lot of these issues come through, but the whole range of health economic issues coming through, not simply economic evaluation. Yes, and there's some reading there. Thank you.